Hello, everyone. It's Sarah Liu, founder and managing director of TDC Global. We'll be commencing the webinar shortly, so I'll give everybody a few more minutes to be dialing in. Hello again. A very big warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today. As I mentioned before, we'll be commencing the webinar in the next minute or so, just to give people a little bit more time to be dialing in and setting up their tech, and we'll be launching into the discussion right away. Great. I think it's time, and that's kick off. Once again, big warm welcome to you all. I am Sarah Liu, the founder and managing director for TDC Global. Before we begin the session today, I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and meet digitally today as well, and pay my respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people among us here today. For those of you who might not be familiar with what we do at TDC Global, I wanted to give you a little bit of introduction about who we are and the work that we do. We're a global diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy, operates primarily across the APAC region. We're headquartered in Sydney, Australia, but about 50% of our business actually comes from Japan, and also across the APAC region, including Singapore, India, South Korea, Hong Kong, and the list goes on. We work with clients, predominantly global multinationals, to support them attract, retain, or advance diverse talent by supporting them and partnering with them on the DEI journey. So over the past 12 to 18 months in particular, a lot of things that we've been hearing from client is the polarization and the debate and the backlash around the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly coming from a lot of our clients who are actually US headquartered. There's been a lot of questions around the trajectory of DEI and where next. What does 2024 and beyond means for the world of DEI, and how do we actually continue to be meaningful and relevant, and what does the future hold for DEI in this region? So knowing that, we actually embarked on APAC-wide research to uncover deep regional insight and chart a path forward for DEI. And this is what the webinar today is about. We'll be sharing with you some high-level discoveries that we have got, and invited two incredible panelists with us, Ben and Helen, who I'll introduce very shortly, to join the discussion and the conversation to bring to life what are some of these insights that we've uncovered, and what does that mean for each one of our organization. And some of the highlights that we've actually uncovered is what the DEI challenge and insight is from mid to large organizations, particularly across Australia, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. How will this DEI trends influence businesses across the region, and also examine key contributing factors that will ensure a successful DEI implementation? Before we launch into the details and the discovery of the research, I know people's questions usually the methodology and what exactly did the research entail, who was actually interviewed. So this was actually done by an independent third-party research specialist that operates also across the APAC region. It's self-administered online and multilingual survey. We collected input and response from over 1,415 respondents across Australia, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And out of that, it was a cross-section of leaders and senior function heads, and also DEI managers, just over 450 of them, and also just under 1,000 of employees and individual contributors. The key area that we explored includes the current state. What does that actually look like in APAC right now? And also future forward, what is the DEI outlook and trends that's influencing the sector? And also the third one being key considerations for achieving DEI impact. So we'll be taking you through, once again, high-level insight, and after the webinar, each one of you will also be receiving a copy of the deep dive, and it's also available on our website for download and circulation if you like that across your organization. Here are some 4 key discovery and highlights that I wanted to share with you. I think it's always very important that as we delve deeper into all the details, to actually start with what are some of the really key and interesting insight we uncovered. The first one is actually maturity. So the DEI progress and maturity varies widely across the region, which we know across APAC being quite a fragmented market. That is something I suppose perhaps to be expected. We uncover that Australia leads in terms of DEI maturity, while Hong Kong and Japan are in the early stages. What was really interesting that we uncovered that was unanimous, one of the few things, in fact, that was unanimous across all the regions, was that 96 of respondents anticipate DEI investment to either increase or remain the same. Only 4% or less respondents feel that foresee that their DEI investment will actually drop in their organization. I think this is really interesting for us because the constant question that we get from client is that, is DEI here to stay or not? But what we're seeing here is not only the investment is going to be growing, the share of voice and the frequency of DEI conversation taking place in the organization is also increasing. So DEI is here to stay. It will continue to be critical. But I think the question for us, as we unpack in this session, is how will that potentially evolve? Then what we also uncovered was the key drivers for DEI activities. Compliance actually takes the top spot, which is a really interesting one because I think it begs the question, is regulatory change and compliance an effective driver, or do we need true leadership conviction and culture transformation to drive real progress? And that will be a discussion point for us later in the piece as well. We also identified a really interesting and acute challenge which is that employees are either less aware or often hold a different belief of their company's DEI status compared to managers. And what we uncovered was that was actually quite a prominent and important influencing factor impacting and having an impact on the effectiveness of DEI implementations within the organization. I don't know if any of you find this surprising or not, but we will be inviting Ben and Helen into the discussion later on. And I'm also encouraging every single one of you to populate any comments, questions that you have in the Q&A box. And we will be addressing these questions or comments that you have across throughout this webinar. So please make sure that you populate them in the chat. Okay, so what do we learn about the current state of business and DEI? What we questioned all the sort of respondent was, what are some of the top focal business challenges facing your business in 2024? The top three that we uncovered was customer satisfaction and retention, operational efficiency and productivity, and employee engagement and retention. And what I want to highlight also here is that this discovery was consistent across different sectors. What was really interesting that actually came out was that DEI intervention is perceived as one of the most beneficial levers to actually support and help with these key priorities. And I think intuitively, everyone who's here would probably anticipate that employee-related issues and DEI comes hand in hand. So that's not surprising. However, what we uncovered was that customer-related issue and how we attract and retain and satisfy our customers, DEI actually is increasingly top of mind. That actually comes in the form of now buyers, particularly government or large organizations, in order to get on their purchasing panel, you need to demonstrate a certain level of DEI maturity. That comes in the form of, if you are a B2C businesses, customers and consumers are actually now expecting a certain level of DEI maturity, perception, and leadership coming from brands that they want to buy and they want to stay with. And it's even more increasingly important that brands, no matter what sectors, that needs to demonstrate that their workforce reflects the customers and the community that they serve. And how do we demonstrate that through DEI becomes increasingly important. So customer satisfaction and retention, operational efficiency, and employee engagement being the top three business priorities across the region. And the importance of DEI in those commercial business management are consistently rated very high, from 87% in Japan and Hong Kong to 90% overall importance in commercial management. Once again, if there are any questions or clarification that you would like as we go through these data points, please feel free to drop them in the chat and in the Q&A session. This came out in terms of future trends in DEI investment influencing factors actually really key. So what we saw was that in Australia, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, consistently across the board, about 95 and 96% sees DEI investment to be increasing. And some of the influencing factors is actually industry trends. So as the industry also increases their investment spend in this space, companies are increasingly feeling the need to reflect that trend in the market. And primary motivation for increased investment is industry standard, and also the key influencing factor for companies that are looking to retain and maintain the investment level is around budget and employee expectation. So despite budget being and the broader economic climate being a key barrier, the unanimous trend shows that there is a steady and increased investment in DEI. The second point that we are delving into is the DEI outlook for 2024 and beyond. So we've established a little bit of the current state of play. What are some of the influencing factor around DEI movement? What are some of the top of mind business challenges facing leaders? So moving forward, what does that look like for us in the region? We questioned all the respondents around the factors driving DEI in APAC workplaces. The number one discovery that we made was compliance need. And you might notice that the percentage doesn't necessarily add up to 100. And the reason being in this question, respondents were able to select multiple choices. And so what we saw in the compliance need was that the percentage of DEI being driven by compliance and regulatory mandate was significantly higher in the Japanese market. I think culturally, it doesn't really surprises us per se, but it's really interesting when we get client questions saying, hey, is target or mandate or quotas actually effective? I think the answer here is that yes, it is effective. What gets measured gets done. However, as we unpack some of the commentaries that came out from the research, we know that cultural transformation needs to come hand in hand to ensure true transformation. Some of the insight that we also uncovered was the preferred DEI support measures that would be effective. So the top pick for DEI managers is actually strategy development, followed by in-person training and also DEI tools. I think this is really interesting and I'd love to hear everyone's perspective and point of view around whether you echo some of these findings in your organization. But I think strategy development is absolutely something core that we see amongst our clients as well. And we know that a lot of times now we are in a stage where DEI is no longer seen as a nice to have, but must have. However, what does that mean for us in terms of overall strategy? How does the global strategy translate to market-specific adaptations? And what does good look like for us? And some of that nuances to ensure effective DEI implementation is top of mind for DEI managers as a topic to solve. We also asked both the leaders and DEI managers as well as the employees, what are some of the DEI support that would be the most helpful for you? And guess what? There is quite a lot of difference and discrepancy between the answers that we received from leaders versus the employees. We saw that in-person training actually leads, which I think sometimes is really interesting because we do get questions from client asking, hey, would training actually be effective in actually educating and actually shaping our culture and DEI maturity? The answer here, what's demonstrated here is that yes, in-person training still very much has a place and is one of the top effective mechanisms to bring your employees on the journey. And what's interesting is that employees actually deem in-person training as more effective and important and helpful compared to managers at 51% versus 39%. And the same applies to e-learning being a really strong alternative, and also tailored programs like a sponsorship, mentoring, and targeted talent acceleration program. Employees see that as highly valuable at 39% compared to manager, which are 10% less. Which once again is really interesting when it comes to how we effectively roll out programs, is actually to make sure that we have a user-centric approach. Who are we trying to influence, and what do they find helpful and useful? And we actually start there. And I think this discrepancy between DEI managers and leaders versus employees creates a really exciting opportunity for us to bridge that through communication and internal socialization and brainstorming and collaboration on DEI-related initiatives. We surveyed the participants to actually let us know some of the top 2024 DEI priorities across the region. This might take a minute to digest, so I'll pause here for a quick second. You can see that under each market, there are actually different components of what they see as the key trends emerging across the region. And the numbers indicate the ranking. So for example, in Singapore and Australia, well-being and mental health is deemed as the first priority, whereas in Japan, it's deemed as a sixth priority. That's how you read this table. As you can see here, the top trends that's emerged across the region is very much well-being, mental health, as well as the anti-discrimination and bullying. And what that falls under is the microaggression discussion that we are increasingly hearing. So that is actually beyond, I suppose, the sort of biases and the discrimination that might be actually more overt in the past. Now it's actually in the more nuanced day-to-day micro behaviors that companies and individuals are seeing as a trend that's emerged. And diverse talent recruitment and inclusive ways of working continues to be top of mind and important across different organizations and across the different regions. I think the insight here is, especially many of us work in a regional role, and what I'll do is also invite Helen and Ben later on to actually contribute to the discussion. But I think aligning DEI efforts, knowing that there are different priorities across the region, and how do we ensure cross-regional and cross-cohort benefits alignment across the board in DEI continues to be a really important component for us to solve. And understanding the regional nuances is really important to make sure that we engage people appropriately on the way. The other thing that I want to also highlight is the difference in the manager versus employee perspective as well. We need to make sure that we've got clarity to align what is important and top of mind for our leaders versus employees, and making sure that the emphasis is placed accordingly, and that feeds into the overall strategic development. Last but not least, the third component that we delved deeper into is the key considerations for effective DEI impact. And the perception of DEI journey amongst managers and employees that we asked paints a really interesting picture for us. So we actually saw quite a lot of discrepancy where managers generally perceive a greater DEI advancement than employees, and indicating the potential gap in awareness and communication. So we had about 39% of DEI managers feeling that they are on the journey, compared to 22% employees who actually sees themselves as uninitiated, whereas you've only got 4% of DEI managers who sees the progress as uninitiated. So generally speaking, not only the stage of maturity is perceived differently across leaders and employees, where they are, and even are they initiated or not, is often a point of contention that was not consistent within the organization. And what that actually tells us is a really interesting insight, that compliance-driven DEI may not always translate to improvement on the day-to-day experience of employees. So we know that especially when we have delivered around compliance need, we might feel a box has been ticked and things have been initiated, but has that actually translated to culture and day-to-day experience and genuine progress? And that is the problem to be solved here. And I'll sort of just very quickly go through this, but I'll leave this with you to digest it in the actual report. Is one of the top challenges faced when implementing DEI is societal attitude. So to bring it all together, and as we launch into the discussion with Ben and Helen, we know DEI remains crucial commercially, strategically, and on a human capital level. We know that commitment to DEI will persist through 2024 and beyond, but the challenge for us and the opportunity for us to take that a step further is to ensure that financial strategic investment in DEI aligns across the different regions within our business, and across the different cohort, across the different career level, to make sure that we maintain a competitive edge, and to make sure that true impact and progress can be felt consistently within the organization. And we, again, as mentioned before, we will have the full detailed report available for download on our website, and you will also receive a document after this session. But what's really more importantly is that our team will be on hand to answer any questions or take you through the specific market implications and what that means for your business in a call. So feel free to reach out to us and our team to make sure you have that conversation with us. So with that, I want to turn the focus to our two incredible panelists. We've got Ben Hopkins joining us today, and he is the franchise director for Oceania from Takeda. And big warm welcome to you, Ben. And we've also got Helen joining us, who is the senior director strategy across APJC at Cisco. Big warm welcome to you too, Helen.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Great. I know we're quite tight on time, so I will launch straight into it. Ben and Helen, what are some of your reflections on the research findings? What surprised you the most?
I'm happy to kick off. I think you covered a lot of them, actually, Sarah. The seeming disparities between the DEI managers and employees was a key one for me. It raised the question for me of whether, if managers think or feel that they're further along that journey than employees, then perhaps what it is that they're doing isn't landing as intended with the employees, or at least that internal narrative of the DEI journey, having the organization understand what it is that they're trying to do and what path they're trying to follow and where are they out along the path. If that difference is there, then that's not being effectively communicated. So that was one of the big ones for me. There are other small differences between managers and employees that were a tad striking. The difference in importance of anti-discrimination and bullying between the two was interesting. But yeah, overall, that difference just in, I think, understanding was a big one for me.
Right.
I think from my side, you know, the reliance almost on compliance, right, to insert DEI into a strategy demonstrates that organizations are struggling to align DEI to kind of revenue streams, right? So where generally in any corporation, your revenue streams is where you will get the most focus on strategy, particularly at points in time, so overall strategy. But then, you know, we've all been subject to the fire drills of, you know, we need to change immediately. And I think DEI kind of has, in many situations, is a long-term strategy. So it kind of, it doesn't appear as that burning platform when you're kind of putting a strategic priority together, which I think is a miss, because I think the reality is our customers are changing. The way we work is changing. In Cisco, we have a phrase, meet our customers where they are. And I think that is about everything from who you're meeting to where you're meeting them to how meetings are conducted, right? Like post-COVID, and COVID has changed that in terms of the intersect of personal and professional is much closer together. And that shows up in the way that we do business. And I'm not sure that we've kind of really designed that into our strategies across the board. And I think as well with that, it's very difficult to really look at tangible impact. Like, how do you put tangible impact of DEI on kind of the on the P&L? You know, how does your finance department kind of show the alignment and draw correlation to financial impact? You know, DEI is not the only place. I mean, we've always struggled with this in terms of kind of employee relations, but I think that's a really important one to think about in terms of how we better do that. What is the equation? What's the algorithm that kind of says, as we do this better, there will be a tangible revenue impact? And, you know, and we know that it's retention of employees and customer satisfaction and all those pieces, and we inherently know that, but how do we kind of really put that in black and white?
And I think demonstrating that in a really clear way is something that I think companies are looking to challenge. And just on that point, Ben and Helen, have you seen instances where that's actually done really well? Or maybe in your past experience, like what has been some of the examples where DEI impact was communicated and that was sort of felt and socialized across the business really effectively?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. And in my experience, that is one of the key misses. I don't think that's something that we as organizations do very well. And it comes a little bit back to, I think, articulating that base level strategy behind DEI of what it is that we're trying to do. It talks to the why, it talks to the journey that we're going to define, and then being able to communicate to the organization well, what does good look like at each stage of that journey? So we'll know that we're making progress. And to your point, what are those tangible benefits back to the business across a multiple array of levels, so that we can start measuring, communicating, not just that we are making progress, that we are moving at each stage and milestone through that journey, but demonstrating those benefits clearly measured. And I think that talks a lot to really understanding the different motivations behind people's aspiration, ambition around DE&I across not just the whole organization, but different demographics within the organization. Your report talked a little bit about some different demographics around age, for example, that started to pull people apart. So that's where I think organizations do need to get quite nuanced within their local internal population. What are the different motivations? And next to that, what are potentially some of the different barriers or reasons for resistance to embracing DE&I, so that if we're going to describe an ambition and the reason for it and how we measure that progress, we can actually start really hitting those different motivations or addressing those different barriers with tangible measurement. And as I say, it's just not something that I think we do well at this point.
I think from my perspective, it's about weaving it into a full corporate strategy versus just about your employee base, right? So for example, and I can speak to Cisco, one of the things that we look at is our partner landscape. We're an organization that work very heavily with a number of different partners, and proactively supporting and choosing and working with partners that are diverse, like with diversity ownership, has been part of our strategic intention. And so we do that. And so we kind of can, and that's something that we can tangibly measure. Look, you touched on quotas and do quotas work and things like that. I think Cisco has been fantastic in terms of representation at board levels, and we see that. I do know that, for example, in McKinsey report, particularly for gender diversity, we still struggle around that middle, it's the kind of the missing rung now, right? Like the glass ceiling has kind of been smashed a little bit, but then there's that missing rung. And I think that representation is across the board. It's not just gender specific, but we do now see more representation at high levels. But how do we make sure we're bringing that to kind of middle management, who I call kind of the engine of organizations, because they're the space where decisions are made, where most employees are kind of impacted. I think one other thing that is interesting that Cisco has done, which and I think this will touch on this later, is we made a pledge to positively impact 1 million people. And that goes more to corporate social responsibility necessarily than DE&I. But what that does is refocuses the culture. And so we very much drive for, regardless, it's not about DE&I, it's about the way that we lead. It's about, saying as an organization, we want a very conscious culture. So you are aware of how you are behaving. You are aware of how you show up. You are aware of the rules of engagement that we set and expectations that we set in this organization. I'm doing primary school interviews at the moment for my son, and it reminds me of like setting up for going to school, right? Like setting expectations about this is how we operate in this environment, how we resolve conflict, how we deal with all those human interactions, which we all have our kind of past biases that we bring with us into the workplace. And so just how it's weaved in terms of our corporate social responsibility, our looking at our impact on the greater world, how we support our employees in doing that as well, then I think also plays back into then how do you show up at work? How are you expected to represent? How do you become a very conscious leader?
I love that, Helen, and it talks a little bit back, Sarah, to your previous question or your point around compliance being this reason for pursuing DE&I, which always feels to me like we're doing this because we have to. Helen, what you described, which is fabulous, is we're doing this because we want to. For our internal employees and for our external partners or customers, we're doing it because, and it sounds a little bit trite potentially, but because it's the right thing to do. So that's how I think we move from D&I as almost this tokenistic thing that we will invest a bit of money, tick a box, undertake some initiatives, and then say, yeah, we did that, to being a part of how we do everything that we do. And when you start doing that, then all of a sudden you're no longer trying to justify levels of investment, because it becomes a way that we do business internally and externally.
I think it's a really good point that both of you touch on around the inherent motivation, right? And how that being a really key influencing factor. Is it a have to? Is it a want to? Is it compliance, or is it a conviction, discussion? So how do you bridge that gap? Because we know that differs from leader to leader. And that's actually what we call like the leadership lottery that we hear from companies. Is that depending on which leader that's like actually championing this, it actually completely determines how far an organization can take it. So how do you bridge that gap when internally you might not have that alignment across the board?
I'll jump in here because
sorry, yeah, you go.
Because I was thinking about this, and I think it's, you really build it into expectations and performance of leadership. Because I think at this point, often we think about performance metrics of a leader, and often we give them, back to financial targets or targets that are them. And I think what's important is, and we do this to a certain extent at Cisco, right? Well, I think we're really moving in this direction, is our culture and our Cisco values are something that we assess people on from a talent point of view, right? We look at, if you're going to be a leader in this organization, do you model the behaviors that we want to demonstrate as an organization, and is fundamentally part of our performance reviews and our cycles? Now, it's a difficult one to measure, so it's not a ones and zeros kind of piece, but it's definitely part of that consideration. And so I think, for me, when I think about, for me, it's always that conscious leadership. And it's about how do we build that into the performance? And if we, KPIs are a little bit difficult to do, but fundamentally we have to measure our leaders on their performance, not only financial metrics, but the impact that they're having on the other humans around them, and ideally the world around them as well.
Absolutely agree. And I think also for me, it starts by defining better for employees what D&I is, because we keep seeing this headline of D&I. And I know when I have conversations with people, they know the obvious things. It's about inclusion of race or religion or orientation. But actually getting more specific for organizations, defining for employees, diversity, it encompasses that full range of dimensions of identity and experience. It includes physical, cognitive, relational, occupational, societal, values related. Define equity, be very specific. It means we provide for all employees fair and equal opportunities based on their individual needs. We don't all start from the same place. We do have varying barriers to access that we need to address. And inclusion the same. So we can come back to defining what it is, then we can start to look at whereabouts in the organization at leadership level, which Helen mentioned, but also throughout every employee within the organization, and looking internally, but also looking externally at how we engage with our customers or partners, with society. I love that, positively impact 1 million people. How are we going to be doing that? How do we aspire to do that? Then you can understand and start to measure, are people engaged with this? Do they understand it? Do they believe it? And I mentioned earlier, if there's any levels of resistance within different parts of the organization, why? Understand that, and then start to address that in the conversations that we have, as well as the activities that we undertake.
And I think, Ben, to that point, you've actually started answering a question that we actually got from the audience, which is, how do we change the conversation from like DEI, like the compliance driver, to the sort of towards being a value driver and having a good commercial outcome? Like, what are some really practical tips that you can share with the audiences, both Ben and Helen, on shifting the DEI driver from compliance based to like value and leadership based?
So I know I talk, I've mentioned a couple of times this concept of resistance to D&I initiatives. A big part of this is to understand, well, whereabouts in the organization at a high level, if you like, those pockets of resistance or those differences in attitudes sit, and building our narrative around them. And part of that, to be honest, I think starts with acknowledging them, understanding them, showing that it's okay to hold different attitudes and beliefs around D&I. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's very important that we're clear that we don't tolerate examples of clear and offensive intolerance, if you like. But this is where we can come back to, and Helen touched on this earlier, the higher level organizational culture. And this is something that I think for multinationals, at the highest levels of leadership, we do need to set that ambition, that expectation around D&I at an organizational cultural level. But then when we get down to local operating companies and individual countries, we can start to translate that through to have those conversations and say, what do you think of this? What do you believe? And if this is the way we're describing it, this is the way we're defining it, and this is how we're trying to show progress, then we can start nuancing that D&I narrative and those interventions. And we can talk specifically to key barriers, as well as talking specifically to what progress looks like and how we measure that progress against them. These sorts of conversations start to become, I think, so powerful in engaging the organization, rather than simply rolling out somewhat, and as I said before, can be perceived as tokenistic interventions, and then having some people who are absolutely engaged on the journey, loving it and embracing it, but those who are not quite so engaged, I think the risk is they do see it as tokenistic. They don't feel themselves as being heard in their attitudes, and I think this is an important one. We risk creating an environment where people don't feel confident to raise objections, because D&I is this hot topic of conversation. Everyone just assumes that we need to be behind it. So you risk pushing that resistance beneath the surface. And that's where, if we do that, we fail to make progress.
Yeah.
I think one thing I would say, and I stole this from someone else, but, you know, inclusion is the verb, right? Equity and diversity is kind of the outcome. And so I think really focusing on inclusion as a core belief, a core, you know, part of the corporate culture, the behavior that we expect from employees to be able to drive that. Now, the other piece of that, and I think it kind of came up a little bit in the report as well, around, are there lots of conversations versus action? And so I also think that, you know, organizations, I'll say at the moment, I don't think many organizations are truly equipped to be able to action and drive consequence of a lack of inclusive behavior, right? Like, I think it's very topical, and I think we ask leaders to kind of stand up and do things where they can and where they feel comfortable, but it's putting a lot of onus on individuals, you know, who really need to stand out, versus building structures that will support that. So I think that's one thing. I think what's interesting as well is more and more we're seeing a real driver for organizations saying, I want to work with sustainable companies. I want to draw a parallel to this movement, because you know, these days, if you don't demonstrate that you're an organization interested in sustainability and doing what you can around sustainable practices, generally other organizations increasingly will decide not to work with you, right? You know, I'm sure you've seen this, but like every RFP is, you know, what is your sustainability position, etc. Things like Great Places to Work and other indexes like that, I think will become more and more prevalent. And more organizations will be asked to meet a certain standard, or be on an index, or be within a, you know, top 100 of Great Places to Work before they'd even be considered as another organization that you would work with. Because I think particularly, and look, it depends on the industry, but in any, for example, professional services industry where where the interaction and connection on people still exists, very, you know, it's core part of the business, is that you want to be working with organizations where people who show up to support your organization or to represent your organization in some ways, or work with your people, hold a similar set of values to to your organization. Sorry, I'm conscious I've said organization a lot there, but you get my point there, where I do think that this motion of inclusivity, the idea of how do we start indexing companies and organizations around how they're doing that, great places to work, and there's others out there, but more and more we'll see that. And then more and more we will see people and organizations selecting, again, to work with companies who show clear progress in these areas.
Yeah, and I think to bring the conversation together and also share some of our experiences, supporting companies shifting from a compliance-driven space to a value-driven space, a lot of the time it's actually, to Ben's point, acknowledging that different voices exist. And I think sometimes that we can do the things that we can do better in the DEI space is actually creating space for those debate and discussion. And very often they feel like topics or things that we shouldn't be debating about. And as a result, what that creates is what we call artificial harmony. So people agree on the surface that yes, it's important and let's all do it, but the true challenge or question are actually not being addressed. And as a result, it becomes tokenistic, right? And so I think acknowledgement, creating a space for not just comfortable conversations, but courageous conversation is a step forward that we can actually drive. What we've also found really effective in our experience working with clients is sharing of lived experiences. Because when it's compliance driven, I think it's a number, it's a percentage that we need to hit. What humanizes this, because ultimately DEI, and we talk about the conscious leadership, Helen, you touched on, is actually a human experience when it comes to DEI. So what we found is that the sharing of and the exchange of lived experiences, either instances where you felt really included or very excluded, and actually take those scenarios out and share that with people, that's actually a really effective way of bridging and I think transitioning people's understanding on this journey. So yeah, I think moving from also individual inclusion, which is, okay, leadership accountability, what you and I will do as individuals, to translating that to organizational structure and organizational inclusion is absolutely key. So once again, I want to remind all our audience to populate your question in the Q&A box down the bottom, and we'll be addressing them as we go. So another question, Ben and Helen, for you is that we have actually seen from the report that there are different priorities coming out, right? And so there are different priorities for the region and across the different cohorts. Do you see that in your organization? One thing being more important to a certain cohort or market compared to the other, and how do you adapt to these ever-evolving priorities and different asks and demands from the cohort, and making sure that your DEI strategy remains true and consistent, but taking into consideration the unique needs from the different groups?
Yeah, I think a good place to start is exactly as you mentioned, having that clear and well-articulated DEI strategy across the organization, because you're right, and I know I've seen it in the past as well. Those different topics, different trends will come up, and it'll be the flavor of the moment, and that's what will get addressed. And it does risk not just becoming a distraction, but it risks people getting a little bit more fatigued with the DEI conversation because it's less consistent. So having that overarching strategy really well articulated and defined, so that the organization essentially stays true to that journey, and whatever the particular inflections or nuances that might crop up either within the internal landscape or externally driven by media, they no longer becomes a distraction because it's consistent with that overall narrative. So you can stick to that ambition of who we want to be, how we want to be, and simply tailor it to something that's topical or relevant at that point in time. See, another thing that I know I've seen, not so much at Takeda, but previous organizations, is a little bit of that fatigue, that there'll be the flavor of the month. And there's a D&I box that has to get ticked at every town hall or at every conference, and it'll be the flavor of the month. and there's no connectivity or consistency. Whereas if you flip that around and that D&I conversation becomes a consistent and ever-present part of describing, again, who we are and how we want to be, then variations in trends simply become the way that you make that topical with news of the day. So it's a subtle shift, but I think it's an important one. And it absolutely starts from having that consistent strategy, that consistent overarching story and narrative. And if that's what everything gets tied back to, then people don't see it as variation or distraction. They simply see it as a continuing reinforcement of culturally, who do we want to be?
Yeah, I think as from a Cisco point of view, my lived experience of it and our experience is very much, we have a unified culture, but we're a global organization. So how do you implement that in India versus Japan versus Australia versus Singapore? Personally, I've lived in Japan for a number of years. I also lived in Singapore, and I'm a native Australian, right? As well as living in the UK and Europe. So for me, it's a really interesting paradigm, because you do see, and you talk about those societal expectations and some of those societal components that are very difficult to shift. And you can't, this is the other thing, we're talking about humans here, and humans are, very messily complicated beings, right? We don't, and we're not very conformist either for the most part. And so you could see very clearly in the strategy, I think the maturity levels differ in terms of the understanding expectation. So I think it goes back to two things. I think one thing that from an organization point of view is, to that point, corporate accountability or kind of the accountability you have as an organization, but also individual accountability. You are responsible for your actions, and you are responsible for your actions in this environment. And we have an expectation of what that will look like. And so that's number one, being very clear about that. I think the other piece is then, where are the places where you can have impact and can have change, right? So a lot of the focus there is about talent acquisition, right? So it's kind of, for me, that's a kind of new space, right? How do we bring people in? How do we change the metrics by bringing new people into the organization? The counter to that is, well, then how do you attrit the part of the organization that actually aren't demonstrating those values as well? And I think that's kind of much harder. I think, I see organizations and ours particularly struggle with that. Like, how do you change that focus? Again, in the report, it talks about the conversation is very different from an age perspective, right? From a generational perspective. How do you refocus that? So look, I think it will never be the same everywhere. I mean, even interesting enough, even having lived and worked in the UK versus lived and worked in Australia, where you'd think they'd be very similar, it's actually significantly different, right? In terms of the lived experience. And so you can't discount that. But I do think it's important about setting a very clear standard, making sure people understand what they are accountable for within their role and within the organization, and then finding the spaces where there is opportunity within that environment, within the context, within the nuance, the way we do with every other part of the business, the way we deal with, exchange rates, the way we deal with the buying models, the way we do with, different legal systems, et cetera, and think about how we really drive change within those spaces and what we can do specifically with those teams and with those groups.
Yeah, I love that point, Helen. I'm keen for your view on this, because it's something that we've talked about internally here. Is we have our D&I ambition, if you like, and we absolutely can and should recruit and attract talent aligned with that ambition. We talk about organizational cultural fit and team fit. We have our ambition and we have where we are today. And a lot of what then, before we talk about, is how do we progress the organization towards our ambition. When you bring people in who are a beautiful fit, they are really well aligned, and they may well be choosing our organization to join because they see that fit. Then they come in and they encounter something very different. They encounter where we are now, and where we are now is always going to be a reflection of a spectrum of demographics and attitudes. If they happen to come into lower end of that spectrum, then it's not just how we potentially treat those who are really just struggling to make that progression, but how do we protect and nurture those that are more progressive that we bring in when they encounter that contrast? And that can be at a leadership level or deeper within the organization.
Yeah, precisely. And we've got another question coming in as well. So I think, as we come to close off the discussion, I wanted to talk about psychological safety, because this is what this question is about. So have you seen best examples of building psychological safety to move away from compliance and towards inclusion, learner, contributor, and challenger safety? And I think that actually brings a couple of things that we talked about together around actually what is it like, how do we cultivate a truly inclusive culture where even challengers, has that psychological safety, and actually sort of just expand our understanding and interpretation and application of psychological safety?
I'll give a really quick one on this one, just because it's, again, something that we do within Cisco. We have employee relation organizations, or like employee representation organizations, EROs. I can't remember exactly what the acronym is now, but like what they are is representative groups that come together within the organization to really, in some ways showcase, and to share that lived experience. We talk about the importance of doing that. And so these groups, and we have almost 100 of them now across the organization, and it's everything from, women with Cisco to Black and African American to Asian cohorts, etc., disability cohorts. So it's such a range, and through those groups, a couple of things happen. Firstly, you create a safe space for those individuals to come and share their stories, right? And to seek guidance and help of, I had this issue or I had this experience. Are there different ways to deal with it? How can I seek support and not feel like, it's going to turn into something that is a structural issue versus me just wanting to have a conversation, seek some help and seek some guidance. Secondly, to that point of creating a challenging environment, this gives these groups a platform to challenge the organization to say, hey, we're not doing well enough at this, or we need to think about this more, or we need to change our policy around this. And so they bring that conversation forward to leadership and to ELT levels, which I think is, to your point around how do you create a safe space to challenge, these groups really kind of bring that to the leadership teams. And I think that's a nice way to do it, and an inclusive way to do it.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think the power of that conversation is so important. There is absolutely a top-down piece where organizational leadership can try and set that tone and set that culture and create those environments. But the environments have to be open enough and, again, safe enough for people to be willing to have that conversation, to raise those voices. And that's tricky. So you've got to be very careful about how you go about creating those. But I also think there's an opportunity for upskilling people, giving them a toolkit, if you like, a set of language, some processes that they can use to support them having those conversations, because that allows us not just to drive that positive ambition, but again, identify those areas where they're experiencing, you touched on it earlier, Sarah, that lived experience. If it's not consistent, if it's not what we want it to be, then it needs to be raised. They need to be able to bring that to the surface in a way that the organization can then respond to it. It takes a lot of courage. So equipping them with the environments, equipping them with the tools, the language, and the permission, I think is important. And then as best as we can, celebrate every opportunity where those conversations do take place, and especially where they can lead to a drive of positive change.
Absolutely. And I think, a comment that we actually just received from the audience is just finding themselves having to have conversations with leaders about not just a culture fit, but culture add, right? And how that is actually the catalyst for innovation for our businesses, having that added layer, having that added diversity of thought, and the psychological safety for us to actually challenge and bring forward these new ideas and different voices. So I think we've had a really riveting discussion today, touch on a lot of different elements around what is a very complex complex and nuanced conversation around DEI, especially across the APAC region. We've actually managed to cover a lot of grounds of what we uncovered in the research as well. So once again, thank you everybody for dialing in today, and specific shout out to Ben and Helen for joining us and contributing your insight and experiences. And another reminder for all the audiences dialing in today to make sure that you download the report and you book in a call with our team to actually walk you through the details of what we found from each of the specific market and what that might mean for your business in 2024 and beyond. Thank you so much. Gratitude to all of you from the team at TDC Global, and we look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.